Hello and welcome. In this video we're going to take a look at some of the special rules that the Grey Knights have access to, and to give you a little bit of an idea of what makes the Grey Knight special. And in the next video we'll take a look at the different brotherhoods, which are the different Grey Knight subfactions, before moving on to the different list videos for the Grey Knights. In any case, before we dive into the special rules, I'd like to say there's a bit of a correction that I should make. In the previous video, which was the buyer's guide, I did make a little bit of a mistake in that for whatever reason, when I was recording the video, I got it into my head that the Librarian and Terminator armor was a different unit than the Brotherhood Librarian. But in reality, these two units are one and the same, and the Librarian as such actually sees way more play than I gave him credit for based on the name that I read on the contents of the Common Patrol. My apologies on that error, and I will say the first Librarian is a much better pickup than I was giving it credit for, so the first Common Patrol is definitely a very good choice if you like the Terminator models. In any case, with that being said, let's move on to the special rules. To begin with, we should take a look at kind of the generic special rules you get for just being a pure Grey Knights army. The generic rule you get for your different Grey Knights units is called Aegis, and it confirms two different abilities that kind of highlight the anti-psyker nature of the Grey Knight forces. This ability has two different parts, and the first one is that your Grey Knight units get a 5+ feel no pain save against mortal wounds, and while this definitely applies against psychic powers, I will say this is much more universally useful than it may first appear, as mortal wounds are definitely a major part of the game. And many armies, even if they don't include psychers, do definitely have a way of generating mortal wounds, whether that's something like the Wrath of Mars in the Adeptus Mechanicus or the various Catan powers within the Necron forces. As such, you're going to actually get a lot more mileage out of this ability than it may first appear, and I think it's definitely a very powerful way of giving expensive and elite armies such as the Grey Knights a way of definitely being a little more resilient than they would first appear. And I'll say this much, I think it's a very interesting ability that really does play into that kind of anti-psyker nature while also being more universally applicable than just simply being an anti-psyker ability. As for the second half of this ability, it's a little more anti-psyker in nature, and that psychers within your army get +1 to their Deny the Witch checks. This is a little more of a niche ability and really kind of depends on if you're playing an army that does include psychic powers, so it won't necessarily come into play against certain armies that simply don't include any psychers, making it much less universal than the first part of this ability. That being said, I think the first part is definitely strong enough to compensate for the second part of this ability, and I think the additional point to Deny the Witch is definitely a nice and flavorful ability that isn't going to be oppressive against psychic armies, but is definitely going to change the outcome of certain psychic checks that your opponent might make, and it's definitely something that's going to come into play, but it's not something that's going to be so overwhelming that a psychic army just feels completely destroyed by you. So that's definitely a good thing, as it keeps the game rather balanced and rather interesting, while also making an army feel rather flavorful. Anyway, with that being said, we can look at the next special abilities that the Grey Knights have access to. Like many other armies, the Grey Knights have access to a set of abilities that they can buy with regular points instead of command points that function similar to traits and relics. Think of them as the Holy Orders for the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Legion commands for the Thousand Suns, the Cryptic Arcana for the Necrons, or many other similar such abilities that are found within different codexes. However, unlike all those other choices, the Grey Knights have two different lists of these kind of abilities. Those abilities are split up into the visions of the Agarium and the gifts of the Prescient, and unlike the upgrades that other factions have access to of a similar nature, all of these are a one-time use ability, so they do kind of end up being a little bit expensive in the sense that once you use them, they're gone and you've pretty much depleted those points. However, that being said, some of them are rather powerful and can be rather useful even for the points that they cost, so there are going to be situations where you do take these abilities. I'm not going to cover all of them just because of how extensive they are, but I did want to mention them, and we will cover them when we see them within different army lists as they're presented, and go over what they do and how they might function within that list when we do come to them. In either case, do be aware of them and how they're a bit different than other character upgrades within other factions that we previously mentioned. And before we move on to the next special ability, I just wanted to say if you're looking to buy some models or some other hobby items, such as collectible trading cards, do visit the link in the description down below to the web store, as it does help the channel out, or simply visit venturetradeco.com where you can find all the different Warhammer 40k kits at a 15% discount from Games Workshop prices that will save you a little bit of money in this expensive hobby, and as such, it'll be a win-win for the both of us. Anyway, with that being said, back to the regularly scheduled content. Now where we get to another universal ability, that's the more interesting part of the Grey Knight forces, and the one that's more akin to the more universal abilities of other factions is the Masters of the Warp ability. The Masters of the Warp is a set of special universal rules that apply to your different Grey Knight models. And to utilize the Masters of the Warp, you have to be a battle-forged army, and at the start of the first battle round, you select one of the 5 different tides of the Masters of the Warp to be active for your army. The 5 different tides are as follows. The first of these tides is the Tide of Convergence, which gives you an additional 6 inches on the range of your different psi weapons, and in addition to that, any unmodified wound roll of 6 on a nemesis weapon scores an additional mortal wound. This can definitely be a very powerful tide to be active, especially if you're going into melee combat with your units carrying different nemesis weapons, or if you need additional range to reach some priority targets with your different psi weapons. That being said, this is one you might want to wait and have active for when you're ready to engage within melee combat, or when you're really in need of it, and it's not necessarily one of the stronger ones until it can start generating those additional mortal wounds. And do note, this is not a psychic power, but it does generate mortal wounds, and this does show the variety of different abilities that can generate such things, and to play into that Aegis ability that the Grey Knights have access to, which gives them a feel no pain save against such abilities, so that's just something to always keep in mind. Anyway, the second tide is the Tide of Clarity, and this one says that when you make an advance or charge roll, the minimum roll you can get is a 3, so any roll for those checks of a 1 or 2 is going to count as a 3 instead, and this can definitely be a very powerful ability for your different melee models, and for any models that want to make it across the table into a certain position extra quickly, as it means you're going to have a minimum range of what your charges and advance rolls can do, as well as pushing up your average roll, considering that reduces the variance. All of a sudden your minimum charge roll is a 6-inch charge, and this can actually be rather beneficial if you deep strike a unit and then try to make a 9-inch charge, because it becomes a lot easier as a lot more roll combinations do score you a successful charge, though it's still a little bit risky, even if it's a little more in your favor than if you're just rolling normally. And I will also say this, as I always say in different videos, a melee unit that fails its charge roll is a melee that fails hitting any of its attacks and is usually going to be shot off the table before it can be effective within the game. And as such, this is actually a very powerful ability, as it can really benefit your charge rolls in many different situations, and you'll make a lot of charges that you would have otherwise failed. I think this is one that you have to kind of consider when it's best to have it active, as there are going to be situations where you want it early on to advance different models across the table, and times where you want to turn it on a little bit later just to make those different charge rolls. Now moving on, the third tide is the Tide of Shadows. This is more of a defensive ability in comparison to the previous two, which were much more offensive. This one says that your units gain the benefit of light cover, or if they're already in light cover, they gain the benefits of dense cover against enemy range attacks that are coming in from more than 12 inches away. This can definitely help you survive against some shooting armies, and one that you generally want to start off with in the situation where you think you're going to need that extra little bit of durability against enemy range attacks, or if you think that the other ones aren't going to benefit you as much as having that extra defensive capability because your opponent is too far away for you to make particularly great use of any other options available to you at the time. And moving on, we come to the fourth tide, which is the Tide of Escalation. The Tide of Escalation is one to do with psychic powers, and it says the Brotherhood units can attempt to manifest the Brotherhood psychic power more than once, but each attempt to manifest that psychic power adds +1 to the warp charge of the psychic check needed to successfully cast that psychic power, regardless if manifestation of that psychic power succeeds or fails. And this one's rather interesting, as it violates the rules of psychic powers in that you can use a psychic power only once each turn, but it's restricted to only the psychic power of the Brotherhood subfaction that you choose to play when building your army, so there is definitely a limitation in terms of how good or bad this is. And finally, the fifth and last tide is probably the most niche one, being the Tide of Banishment. The Tide of Banishment is one that's only going to come into play when you're fighting against demon units. This tide has two different parts to it, the first one being that enemy demon units within 6 inches lose 2 points of leadership, and this counts as an aura ability, so as long as this tide is active, this aura applies and reduces the leadership of those enemy demon units. The second part of the tide is also a little bit of a minor perk, in that when making attacks against enemy demon units, you can reroll a hit and wound roll of 1. That's also a bit of a minor perk, but it can definitely quickly add up, and it definitely can come into play against certain armies. But once again, I don't think it's necessarily an oppressive power against armies that it's good against. This is more of a flavorful inclusion to show the Grey Knight capabilities of fighting against demon armies, which they do specialize against, and the times that it comes into play is definitely going to be fun, but it's definitely going to be a bit of a rarity, except for in situations where you really want it. Now, at the beginning of this, we mentioned that at the first battle round, you select one of the tides to be active, so how do you change which tide is active? Well, to change the tide that is active, there is a psychic power that you have to cast in order to change which tide is currently active. This psychic power is called Warp Shaping, and it's a blessing psychic power with a warp charge value of 4. So it's not necessarily the hardest psychic power to cast, but you do have to remember that you have to have a unit that knows a psychic power and successfully casts it, and that will lead into the psychic powers that that unit can cast for that turn. However, if you successfully manifest this psychic power, you select one of the tides of the warp that has not been active for your army during this battle, and that becomes a tide that is currently active. As such, you are limited in terms of how you can use these tides and how you can use this psychic power. This means that when you go into a game, you have to have some idea of which tide you're going to start off with and which ones you're going to change into depending on which turn you're going into. It's a little bit hard to say of which one you always want to start off with and which one you want to go into in every specific game because each game is going to be a little different and each army is going to be a little different as well. There are going to be times where you want a more offensive or defensive tide to be active at the beginning of the battle, and you kind of really have to ask yourself, what do you need the most in the situation where you're starting off the game? If you're going second, you probably want to be a little more defensive, and if you're going first, you might consider being a little more offensive. In addition to that, you have to ask yourself, when is the correct time to switch to a different tide, and how quickly are you going to need to switch into that different tide, as really taking full advantage of this ability can really shape how successful you are within the game. Because think about it this way, if you're planning to go first and advance as hard as you can and then hide behind terrain, do you necessarily want the ability to have additional light cover if your opponent can easily get within 12 inches to essentially negate that ability because you moved up so much on the board on the first turn? Inversely, if you're going second and your opponent definitely has enough shooting to get enough positions on you that they can put a lot of pressure onto your different units, you don't necessarily want to be in the tide that helps you advance across the table, especially when you could have benefited from the additional bonuses of having light cover or even dense cover. It's something you're going to have to get used to deciding depending on the game state and who your opponent is and depending on what situation you expect to find yourself in, so it's something that's going to come over time as you play more games with your Grey Knight forces. Now there's one more special ability that I want to cover before wrapping up this video. That set of special abilities being the Litanies of Purity, which are essentially like the war hymns for the Sisters Battle in that a Grey Knight priest unit can try to inspire one of these litanies, and to inspire a litany, they have to roll a 3+ in order for that litany to become active. All Grey Knight priests know the Litany of Expulsion in addition to one additional litany that they pick from a list of 6 different litanies. So let's take a quick look at those different litanies, even though they primarily affect the chaplain within the Grey Knight forces. The Litany of Expulsion is an aura litany that when it is active, it says that if this litany is inspired, then while a friendly Grey Knight core unit or character unit within 6 inches of the priest makes a melee attack, they can roll the hit roll for that attack. This can definitely make your melee attacks much more accurate, and it's definitely a nice little ability to have that is reminiscent of the war hymn that all the different Adeptus Sororitas priests know, and it functions much in a similar way in terms of how it becomes active. And do remember that you can only have one of each litany active each turn, so you can have multiple instances of the same litany active in the same turn, even if you have multiple characters that can intone the same litany. Now let's take a look at the additional 6 litanies that the priest unit can choose from and then inspire. These all have the restriction that if they target a friendly model, they have to target a Grey Knight's core or character unit. So with that being said, do keep that in mind, and let's take a look at the different options. The first of those different litanies is the Word of Power, and it says, you select the core or character unit within 6 inches of the priest inspiring this litany, and when that unit makes melee attacks with a nemesis weapon, a non-modified wound roll of 6 scores an additional wound hit against that target. In addition to that, if the Tide of Convergence is active, that attack also scores an additional mortal wound, meaning that if you have Tide of Convergence active and the unit is being inspired by the Word of Power and you roll that unmodified 6 to wound, you score 2 additional mortal wounds and an additional wound hit, and that can really add up really quickly as there's quite a lot of additional damage coming in rather quickly. The second litany that you can choose from is the Atonement for Guidance. The Atonement for Guidance allows you to select a Grey Knight core or character unit within 6 inches, and that unit ignores all ballistic and hit modifiers for its range attacks, which can definitely be very useful if fighting against an opponent that has ways of modifying your ballistic skill or your hit ability. And many different armies have different ways of modifying those different stats and making it harder for you to successfully make use of your different range weapons. So definitely a good choice and definitely a nice ability to have in situations where it's important, as it can really help out the accuracy of your different units. The third litany you can choose from is the Psalm of Purity. The Psalm of Purity is an aura ability with a range of 6 inches, and what it says is that when a unit affected by this aura ability rolls an unmodified wound roll of 6, they add an additional point of armor penetration to that attack's armor penetration characteristic, and that can definitely help out against heavily armored armies, as it can really add up with your natural armor penetration and make it so that you're more successful in damaging the enemy models. The fourth litany you can choose from is the Refrain from Convergence, and this one highlights the anti-sucker capabilities that different armies with abilities like this can have. This ability says you select a friendly Grey Knight core or character unit within 6 inches of the priest inspiring this litany, and you remove any enemy psychic effects that might be affecting that unit, and enemies cannot affect that unit with their psychic powers until the start of your next command phase. So this definitely is a great way to remove and prevent negative modifiers that your opponent may have access to if they have psychic powers within their army. Definitely a good ability, though definitely a little bit niche depending on what you're playing against, so it's something you have to consider, but not necessarily something you're going to use every single time. The fifth litany is the recitation of projection. This is a litany that allows you to select a friendly core or character unit within 6 inches, and you add 6 inches of range to their bolt weapons. In addition to that, you add 6 inches to their different side weapons, unless the Tide of Convergence is active, in which case you only add an additional 3 inches to their side weapons, giving you a total of 9 inches of extension when both this litany and the Tide of Convergence is active. Not the best litany to have, but not the worst one either, as it can definitely give you that little bit of extra range in order to reach enemy models with some of your different weapons and take them off the table before they really become a threat. But that's going to be a bit more of a niche situation than some of the other litanies, but at the same time, there are definitely going to be times where you really wish you had this one. And finally, the sixth and last litany is the Invocation of Focus, and this is yet another aura litany. This aura says that units within 6 inches are affected by this litany, and those units gain +1 when doing their psychic tests in order to cast blessing psychic powers. This isn't necessarily a bad litany, but this one does feel very specific in terms of its usage. Though do note that the Grey Knights don't have a whole lot of ways of buffing their own psychic capabilities, and sometimes it's going to be important for you to have a more consistent way of activating some of your psychic powers, though at the same time it's kind of a big investment to take this litany in specific, and it's a bit of a tricky one to use because you definitely want to make sure you're getting your full value out of it if you're going down this route. In either case, I do think the Grey Knights definitely have a lot of different special abilities that definitely have a lot of interesting applications, and I do think they do give the army a very unique feel in terms of how it functions, while giving it a lot of that flavor of being an anti-psyker army that also knows how to deal with demons and other matters of the war. In any case, which of these different special rules do you find the most interesting, and did any of these rules kind of inspire you to play the Grey Knights? Let me know down in the comments down below, and as always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the content, like and subscribe, and don't forget, visit VentureTradeCo.com for your different hobby needs. Thank you very much, have a great day, and see you next time. Bye.